I want to talk to you about something called render files. Now, some of you may already know what a render file is, but let me try to quickly explain what that is all about. As you edit a program and you start putting more effects and more filters onto a clip, sometimes the computer cannot keep up. And what happens is you'll drop frames on playback. Now, that can be very frustrating. So a render file is simply the computer calculates in advance all those complex mathematical formulas to convert pixels to other pixels and writes that file down so when I play back the clip, it plays back smoothly. Now, if you look at my timeline, you'll notice there are some red and some yellow lines above the tracks. And your first impulse might be, well, yellow is a warning and red is a full stop, but that's not the case in Premiere. What a yellow line indicates is that Premiere Pro will have to do some sort of translation or rendering on the fly, but it won't drop any frames. What red indicates is that it may play back without dropping any frames, but they're not guaranteeing anything. Let's take a look at the playback of this green screen at the very end of this sequence.
In addition to being on newsstands in the United States and Canada, you could also find...
Well, it doesn't appear that any frames are dropping, but I want to make sure, and there's a nice feature in Premiere Pro that allows me to turn on something called the drop frame indicator. And this is a little green button that, when stays green, says we've played every frame. If it goes to yellow, it means that some frames were dropped, and then if it goes to red, you know you have a problem. And in this case, you'll actually need to pre-render or render the files because it can't play back in real time. Let's go ahead and hit play on our green screen, and this is pretty complex. This has multiple layers, a chroma key, a color correction, I'm generating a background, and even doing a blending mode to get some transparency.
Find the Pages of Delight on newsstands in Greece, Finland, Germany, Spain.
Now, I still didn't drop any frames, and this is a relatively moderate machine. It's a several-year-old Macintosh with only 8 gigabytes of RAM and a medium video card, and I'm still getting some fairly robust playback. Now, just to prove to you that this can change colors, I did create an insane piece of video that may drop some frames. As a matter of fact, I put so many filters on this that I would never use this in a show, but let's see if we can get that green to change to at least yellow.
Which I hate, and you're sitting there eating with a fork and knife while everyone else is picking it up, so I like that this...
So there you go, I dropped some frames, and if I put my cursor on top of that little indicator, it even tells me how many frames I dropped during playback. Technically, if I can visualize what the effect looks like in my head, I don't have to worry about drop frames during playback while I'm editing. But if my producer is sitting there and they want to see it with its natural flow, I may need to render. Premiere will always render anything that it needs to on export to make sure you don't need to drop frames. So let's talk about rendering. You'll find the render command underneath Sequence in your drop-down menu. And there's a couple of choices here. You can render effects into out and just render into out. I'm going to explain what that is, but first of all, let me actually mark an in and out point that's not the entire timeline so you can see the net effect. As a matter of fact, I'm going to mark it with an in point in the yellow and an out point in the red area. Now, if I go up under here and I choose to render effects into out, Premiere will render only things that have a red line above them.
Those onions actually smell good.
As soon as the render is done, you'll see it'll start playing back, but if you notice, the yellow line is still there. The red line has turned green, which says, oh, I've created a render file, so you have real-time playback.
Really good.
One of my favorites.
So as you can see, the green dot won't change to yellow because it's looking at the render file and not having to do all the math on the fly. Now, if I had chosen the other option, which is render into out, Premiere Pro will actually look at both yellow and red lines, so its real-time playback functions, as well as its effects functions, and render everything.
Those onions actually smell.
Now that went pretty quick because it only had to render the yellow section. The red section was already done, so even if you by accident select the same area to render over again, Premiere Pro is smart enough to know that it's already done the work once. So that's an idea how render works. If you want to use a keyboard shortcut for that, as you can see underneath the sequence settings for render effects in to out, well, it's the return key on a Macintosh or the enter key on a Windows machine.